Okay, so next up is going to be looking at some of the skull stuff for lecture 16. And really, the idea here is to give you guys some additional pictures if you didn't take any in lab, or make sure I go over a couple of things to help you with your lab practical as well as your lecture exam. And we're going to do a couple of things in terms of reviewing how fetal bones develop in the skull. I might go into a little bit more detail than what I did in lecture. And I know it says here, build the head. We're not going to worry about building the head this semester either. I just didn't have time for it, and I don't think you guys really need it that much. Um, I think some of the more important stuff here is things to think about in terms of like making sure that you understand the bones as well as the different structures that are found on the skulls that you were supposed to observe during lecture, and think about what sits there, what goes through there. And I'm going to go over some of the cranial nerve stuff as well, but for your practical you don't have to know all of that unless you're in a class where I added more stuff to it. So make sure you read over your lab practical information and your lab manual. So here I just have a couple of pictures of some of the skulls from class that you had in your class. And I was just going to go over just a couple things that maybe sometimes are a little bit confusing to students. So what you should see is, like these not perfectly straight lines where you can see where bones have come together, right? So things like the frontal bone, and then here we have another kind of like more squiggly line right there that leads to another squiggly line right there. And then this other squiggly line, I'm going to label in a slightly different color, should be like right about there-ish. So we have like our frontal bone here. We have the two parietal bones on the top. We'll have our occipital bone in the back. We'll have the temporal bones on the lateral sides. And there's sutures that are going to separate each of these bones from each other. So we have the coronal suture, we have a squamous suture, the lambdoid suture in the back, and then occipital mastoid suture. If you look at the top of the skull, which I think I don't have a picture of here, you would have another suture right there between the parietal bones, and that's going to be the sagittal suture, okay? So there are 8 cranial bones. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Temporal bones are paired, parietal bones are paired. The other 2 bones that you can't see very easily is this one, which is the sphenoid bone. And then right here in the frontal bone, that's what this is the ethmoid bone. So even though I wrote only 6, remember 2 and 4 are paired bones. So that's where the other 2 bones are. So number 6 is the ethmoid bone, and the ethmoid bone has specific structures that you can see internally. And those structures would be like maybe 6A and 6B here. 6A is this mohawky part that comes straight up, which is called the crista galli. This is where the meninges of the brain attach. And then the plate, this depression here with the holes in it right next to it, 6B, that's the that's the cribriform plates where the olfactory bulb sits, which is part of cranial nerve number 1. Number 5, you can also see on this skull that has been slightly disarticulated, where the parietal bones have been removed. That's actually the sphenoid bone right there in the internal view, which you can see a little bit better internally. And then again, this is number 4, the temporal bone. This is number 3, the occipital bone. And then you can see that nice internal right here. This is the occipital mastoid suture because it's going between the temporal bone and the occipital bone. Okay, you should make sure you know all of these holes that are going to be found in these different bones. So right here you see the optic canal, which is where cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, passes through. And then this is the lesser wing. So that's the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. And this is the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. Right underneath the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone is where the superior orbital fissure is, and several cranial nerves pass through there. And then you'll see another hole. That's the foramen rotundum, right next or underneath that is the foramen ovale, and then the foramen spinosum is the smaller one just back behind the foramen ovale right there. So within the sphenoid bone on the medial side, you'll see there's another hole there. That's the foramen lacerum, which is actually not a real hole in the skull. It's only a hole in the skull when all the connective tissue has been removed. And then we have this nice seat here. This is the sella turcica, where the pituitary gland is going to be sitting and cradled so that it doesn't get jostled when you move your head back and forth in different directions. And then on the temporal bone, on the internal side, you should see a nice depression right there. That nice depression right there is the internal acoustic meatus, where cranial nerves 7 and 8 actually sit. This is where you vibrate the skull in order for sound to go into the hearing and balance organ, the vestibular cochlear organ, and then that gets transmitted towards the brain. And then this nice big hole here, big enough that I usually tell my students you can fit a plastic straw through, except for we are in California and they don't sell plastic straws anymore. So a paper straw, you can put a paper straw through, is the jugular foramen. So that you see the jugular foramen actually goes between the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. It is not lobe, I'm sorry, the temporal bone and the occipital bone. It's not actually a hole in one of those bones. It is a hole that goes between those two bones. As those two bones develop together, the internal jugular vein is also forming right there. So those bones actually form around the internal jugular vein. And then everybody should know, right? Foramen magnum. And then on this skull, you can see there's a slight depression on the side right there. That's where the hypoglossal canal is going to be. So if you go over the cranial nerves, you'll see that cranial nerves actually sit in the skull, going from 1 to 12, 1 being at the cribriform plate and 12 going all the way to the hypoglossal canal. Other stuff on the lateral side of the skull here is that you can see there's a nice opening right there for the external acoustic meatus. We can see this nice pointy projection here is the styloid process, and then we have a nice mastoid process right there. Part of number 5, the sphenoid bone, are these plates. So you see there's a plate here and slightly you see a plate next to it. That's actually the same one, but there's another one there. These are the pterygoid plates. And I know whoever named them, I don't know why they made them so difficult. So those are the pterygoid plates. One is lateral, so the outer one, and then the one inside is the medial one. And actually those are part of the sphenoid bone. Then we see this nice arch here. This is the zygomatic arch, which is going from the temporal bone to this bone right here. This bone right here is actually the zygomatic bone, which is a facial bone. So I did take some anteriorly situated pictures as well, so you can see that this whole thing is the orbit. The orbit is where your eyeball sits, and inside of the orbit, you see things like there's the optic canal, we see superior orbital fissure, and we see inferior orbital fissure right there. So some of you who came to Open Lab were getting this confused. It's not supraorbital, it's superior orbital fissure and inferior orbital fissure, because right up above, right about there-ish, there should be a notch, and that's called the supraorbital notch or foramen. And right above the orbit, right about there, so here, right there and right there, we have infraorbital foramen. Pay attention to how those are spelled. You don't want to misspell those things on a practical, because it's like, well, I'm not really sure if you know what that is, okay? The orbit is made of several bones, so you can actually see all of that is actually part of the sphenoid bone here, and then this is the frontal bone. We see the nice suture right there for the ethmoid bone, and then we see another suture right here, and that's going to be the lacrimal bone. Here's the nasal bone, which doesn't make up part of the orbit. And then the other part of the orbit is the maxilla, which is this bone right here. which makes up your upper jaw. Okay. So you see that those nice like nasal bones here. This is the maxilla. This will be where the lacrimal bone is, and then the ethmoid bone is more posteriorly situated on the medial side of the orbit. Inside of the nasal opening, you see those nice inferior nasal conchae. There's a middle one up there, which I didn't get a picture of. And then this is the nasal septum, which is actually divided into two portions. The upper portion is the perpendicular plate, and the inferior portion, no, maybe not green. The inferior portion is the vomer right there. So then we look at the underside. I basically took off the mandible so that you could see a couple of things with regard to the mandible. And then when you look at the underside, again, you can see all those holes and some of the things that went through. So like this is still the maxilla, except for this, you'll see there should be a suture right there. So this flat part of the maxilla is called the palatine process. And then you have a nice depression here called the incisive fossa, where a cranial nerve comes out to innervate the teeth. Back behind the palatine process, this is the palatine bones itself. Sorry, it's a little bit dry. So remember, the hard palate is made up of both the maxilla and the palatine bone. And then underneath the palatine bone, this portion here is the vomer. So the vomer is best seen from the inferior aspect. Then we see this is the medial pterygoid plate. This is the lateral pterygoid plate, which is actually part of the sphenoid bone. You have foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, foramen lacerum, which are all part of the sphenoid bone. And then this is the temporal bone where the zygomatic bone actually meets the temporal bone. There's a nice fossa here. That's the mandibular fossa where our temporomandibular joint is found. And that fossa holds this condyle here, which is the mandibular condyle. And then we see styloid process. There's the mastoid process. So this little hole between them is stylomastoid foramen. And if you tilt the skull enough, on the inferior side, what you should see is this nice big hole here is the jugular foramen, and right above it is carotid canal. Because we're going to see that we're going to have in common carotid and internal jugular running parallel in the neck, and when they diverge and they go into the skull, they're still running parallel. So you need a hole for each one of those blood vessels that are going back up into the skull. Foramen magnum is right here. Here's our This is a hole that a lot of people ask me about what it is, and I'm not entirely sure. Actually, the hypoglossal canal goes underneath this part. That part is the occipital condyle where the atlas sits. And I was trying to think, oh, there's foramen ovale. So what you should notice on this inferior side is you don't see foramen rotundum because foramen rotundum comes forward instead of going downwards. And then on the mandible, we said mandibular condyle, we see the coronoid process where the temporalis muscle comes and inserts to help us pull up our jaw. On the backside here, you have the mandibular foramen, and then on the front, you have the mental foramen where cranial nerve 5-3 goes through to innervate the lower jaw. And then you have the angle of the mandible, and like this part is the ramus of the mandible, and the rest of it is the body. Okay, so that's a rundown of a couple of things on the skull. You want to make sure you go over everything on your list so that you know it. Maybe use these pictures to help you with some labeling. Next part is I'm going to go over briefly some developmental aspects of the skull.